Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's had a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan, and I'm just gonna get all that wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way first. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so, just down below. If you like the content you see, don't forget to give a like. And of course, any love, comments, suggestions, all those wonderful things, there's a comment section down there as well for all of that. Today we are diving back into the Ghostly Echoes series. We had been working our way through British Columbia, so now we are going east. We're skipping over Alberta because we already did that one, and we are diving into the ghost stories of Saskatchewan. So I hope you guys enjoy these next few spooky tales. This story takes place in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, a ghost with good timing. In 1943, I was working in a little lunch counter type of restaurant in Prince Albert. Recalled a woman named Dorothy. It was just a greasy spoon, but the tips could be pretty good. The place had a few narrow booths along one wall, but was dominated mainly by a big horseshoe-shaped counter. During the busy breakfast and lunch rushes, Dorothy and another waitress both worked inside the horseshoe, taking orders, fulfilling coffee cups, and serving up plates of hot specials. Few of their customers chose to sit in a booth, for chatting and joking with the two women was considered part of the restaurant's appeal. I had a whole lot of fun working there, Dorothy remembered. Everyone got along. We had some good regulars, and everyone liked a joke. Having a good sense of humor can help you get by too. Like whenever I'd made a mistake, or the other girl we'd look dead serious and blame it on the ghost. That was such a long-running gag that some customers would come in and say, "Dorothy, I'll have a bowl of soup and a fried egg sandwich, and don't let the ghost get near it." One afternoon, the ghost jokes were overheard by a new customer. The man lingered drinking coffee long after most of the lunch customers had left. When Dorothy came over to refill his cup for the fourth time, he made her an offer. "I know an empty house where there's a real ghost," he said. "I've seen it many times. I can take you there some night if you'd like." Dorothy was intrigued and made a date to meet the stranger outside the restaurant that evening. Years later, she would shake her head at such foolish behavior. A lot of us girls were pretty naive back then, but he was an older, nicely dressed man, and honestly, I didn't think of it as a date. I guess he did though. It was August, so there were still hours of daylight remaining when the man pulled up to the curb in front of the restaurant in his late model sedan. Dorothy climbed into the passenger seat and was a little surprised when the man leaned over and kissed her. "The ghost won't come out until after dark," he said, as he put the car in gear, "so let's get a couple of drinks." Dorothy wanted to seem calm and worldly, so she had agreed. 10 minutes later, she was sitting in a bar with a powerful, foul-tasting highball in front of her. "I was used to drinking the odd beer," Dorothy said, "but I had my dad's homemade wine. But this was hard liquor. It tasted awful." Despite her distaste for the drink, Dorothy's date was insistent that she keep up with him. Each time he ordered a drink for himself, he ordered one for Dorothy too. Fortunately, a sympathetic bartender interceded silently on the young woman's behalf. When I took the first sip of my second drink, Dorothy remembered, it was nothing more than ginger ale. I had no problem matching that fellow glass for glass then. The evening wore on and Dorothy grew more bored. Eventually she stood up, grabbed her purse, and made an excuse about having to be up early the next morning. No, wait," her date slurred. "We haven't seen the ghost yet." The man threw some money on the bar and took Dorothy's arm. As they walked out to the parking lot, she noticed that it had become very dark while they had been inside. Even the stars and moon were hidden by an overcast sky. "It's not far from here, this haunted house," the man said as he started the car. In the reflected glow of the headlights, Dorothy thought she saw an odd, humorless smile touch the man's lips. Suddenly she wished she was back in the bar with the understanding bartender. Even more than that, she wished she was in her cheap rented room above the restaurant, curled up in bed with a paperback romance. Mostly, she wished she had enough sense to say no to this stranger hours earlier. But the car was moving, and the lights of Prince Albert were fading as the man drove her out of town. After a few miles, the man turned onto a secondary road, then down a long gravel road that was obscured with shaggy pine trees. The drive led to a hidden yard with a 2-story house that sat as dark as a tomb. I remember that man leaning over after he stopped the car, and he looked just like the cat that ate the canary, said Dorothy. He said, "We're here. Are you scared yet?" I can tell you by that point I was, but I wasn't thinking much about the ghost. The man led Dorothy across the overgrown yard to the rotting front porch. In the dark, he showed her where she could step without breaking through the disintegrating planks. Using a small piece of heavy wire, he easily picked the lock. The door swung open with a rusty groan of its hinges, and the couple walked inside. There was a coal oil lamp sitting on the cold, unused iron surface of the stove. The man struck a match against the stovetop and touched the blooming yellow flame to the lamp's wick. As flickering dim light washed across the kitchen and living room, Dorothy could see that the place had been deserted for some time. Thick dust had settled softly on every surface. Spiders had constructed elaborate webs on the few pieces of broken furniture that remained. Dorothy asked the man how he knew about this house, and he gave her a vague answer. She asked how often he visited it, and he was even more evasive. Dorothy could see one place where there were fresh footprints in the dust. However, on the stairs that led to the second-floor bedrooms, she would later remember the moment well. I was just thinking about this, and it was like he was reading my mind, because this fellow suddenly said, "Oh, we have to go upstairs. That's where the ghost is." I was going to say no, but then I thought, what difference does it make? I was already stuck there. I was already in trouble, so I went upstairs. At the top of the staircase, the man pointed to the doorway at the end of the hall. "The ghost shows up in there," he said. "There's a mattress on the floor, so we can be comfortable while we wait." As he started toward the bedroom, however, Dorothy paused. She could see a cracked mirror and the basin in the small room to her right. "Give me a minute," she said. "I want to use the bathroom." The man looked back at her impatiently. "There's no water," he said. "I know," Dorothy hesitated, then improvised. "I want to fix my hair and lipstick. Can I have the lamp?" The man looked amused, but handed over the lantern. He walked into the bedroom, and Dorothy stepped into the tiny washroom, having bought herself precious seconds to formulate a plan. Dorothy's mind raced over her options. It was too far back to town to consider walking. The man had his car keys in the pocket of his trousers, so it wouldn't be easy to get them. There was no way she could overpower him, and there was no one nearby who might help her. Dorothy gazed into the speckled mirror with its jagged fracture. Her face was split into 2 mismatched halves, and each one wore a look of fright. Apparently she was not alone, however, for at that moment a scream pierced the air. Startled, Dorothy ran out of the bathroom to the end of the short hallway, so very nearly collided with her date, who came stumbling out of the bedroom, clutching his shoes and his jacket near his chest. "Run," he gasped, "run. There really is a goddamn ghost." With that, he tore down the hall and half stumbled, half slid down the narrow wooden staircase. Dorothy was too shocked to follow, however, and stood staring into the dark bedroom. Then, in a split second, she realized that her real problem had very likely been averted. Relief washed over her, and she experienced a little boost of courage. "I was standing there, and I thought if you were stupid enough to get into this situation, at least be brave enough to see what you came for," said Dorothy. In 3 bold steps, she was inside the bedroom. "At first I couldn't see a thing," she recalled. "But I'd left the lamp down the hall, remember? But then I heard something, like a swooshing sound. and I could feel the air swirling around me. It was cold, but I knew there was nothing to be afraid of. When that pocket of air swirled away from me into the corner, I could see that it had a little light of its own, sort of a hazy glow. Dorothy then realized that if she didn't want to be stranded, she had better leave. She turned and walked out of the bedroom door, but not before speaking to the faint white mist in the corner. "I told it thank you," she said. Outside, Dorothy found her date depositing the remainder of his cocktails in a stinking puddle between his feet. She climbed into the car and waited patiently until the man was steady enough to get behind the wheel. The two then shared a silent ride back into Prince Albert. As the man pulled into the curb beside the restaurant, Dorothy's curiosity overcame him. I asked him what he'd seen up there. She remembered. The man's answer wasn't entirely satisfying. "He told me, I don't know, but I don't ever want to see it again," she laughed, as she stood on the sidewalk and watched the sedan drive off into the distance. Dorothy was certain of two things. The man was unlikely ever to lure another girl out to the deserted farmhouse, and she would never again fall for such a ruse. One other thing changed as well. I didn't joke so much about our ghost at the restaurant after that, Dorothy admitted. I just had more respect for spirits and things, and I felt that I shouldn't have to pretend to be using one as a scapegoat. Dorothy never met another ghost, but always remained grateful to the one that rescued her in a dusty, deserted Saskatchewan farmhouse. This story takes place in Regina, Saskatchewan, the noisy farmhouse. It was 1976, and after years of working in Ontario, a young woman named Donna was happy to be moving back to her hometown of Regina. Donna's parents and sisters were no longer living there, but she loved the familiar surroundings and the opportunity to reconnect with old friends. Also, her grandparents, with whom she had remained close, lived just a short drive away on a farm near South Hay. Once Donna had settled into her new job and apartment, she arranged to visit her grandparents for a weekend. It was a crisp fall day, and as Donna drove her car north under a seamless dark blue sky, she realized how much she had missed this world of her childhood. It felt so good to see all these familiar landmarks, she explained, and to know that soon I would be sitting in my grandma's kitchen with a mug of tea. All the years I'd been down east, I never knew how much I missed home. I guess I didn't let myself know because I could rarely afford to come back and visit. Later that afternoon, as Donna basked in the warmth of her beloved grandparents' company, she resolved to make up for lost time. She would now visit often and do what she could to help the elderly couple with the house and garden. Because she lived so close, she reasoned that nothing could stand in her way. By 2 a.m. the following morning, she was reconsidering. After an evening of conversation and too many home-baked treats, Donna had been sleepy and content. She said her good nights and retired to the small bedroom across the hall from her grandparents' room. She changed into a nightshirt and settled comfortably into the bed, which she remembered sometimes sleeping in as a child. She would later estimate that she was asleep within minutes, just before 10 p.m. 2 hours later, as midnight approached, she awoke with a jolt. I remembered that by the time I opened my eyes, I was already on my knees in the middle of the bed, Donna recalled. At first, I wasn't sure what had scared me, but within a few seconds, it started again. It was a loud, sharp knocking sound coming from the wall directly above the head of Donna's bed. Clearly, there was no one else in the room, so Donna peered cautiously out the window to see if something outside the house might be creating the noisy effect. By the full light of a harvest moon, she saw nothing. The rapping continued off and on for about 10 minutes. When it stopped, it was another half hour before Donna felt calm enough to go back to bed, and sometime after that before she drifted off to sleep. She should hardly have bothered, though, for 2 a.m. she was awakened once more. This time the hammering sounded like it was coming from the hallway outside my room, she said. I summoned up my courage to take a look, and when I put my hand on the doorknob, it was actually vibrating from the sound. But there was nothing in the hallway to explain the noise. Donna spent most of the night trying in vain to find the source of the racket, which moved from the hall to the bathroom and finally into the kitchen. At first she couldn't understand why her grandparents' sleep had not been disturbed, but eventually reasoned that because they were both somewhat deaf and were taking various medications, they weren't as easily roused. By the time the sun's reassuring rays began to penetrate the gauzy kitchen curtains, Donna had resolved not to tell her grandparents about her night's adventure. The knocking sounds were disconcerting, but they did not seem dangerous. She felt it best not to frighten the elderly couple, particularly when she had no explanation for what she had heard. Donna kept her secret and drove back to Regina later in the day, where she enjoyed a long, undisturbed night's sleep. 2 weeks later, Donna drove up to the South Hay farm again. She was somewhat apprehensive about the mysterious nocturnal noises, but tried to convince herself that it had either been her imagination or at most a one-time occurrence. By 3 o'clock the following morning, as she put a pillow over her ears to drown out the sound of banging on her ceiling, she knew she was wrong. I finally understood that it was going to happen every time, and I started to plan for it, said Donna. I bought these industrial earplugs that blocked out a lot of sound, and they helped quite a bit. I also got into the habit of keeping a little bottle of Kahlua in my overnight case. If I had a bit of that at bedtime, I seemed to sleep more deeply. For the most part, these measures helped, and Donna was able to enjoy many weekends at the farm. She was grateful for that time, for in the early 1980s, her grandfather passed away. Not long after, Donna's grandmother sold the farm, and because of health concerns, moved into extended care facility in Regina. There, Donna visited often, but things weren't the same. The older woman's memory had deteriorated to the point where she sometimes did not even recognize her devoted granddaughter. She had her occasional lucid moments, however, and Donna remembers one of them well. We were sitting in this lounge area that they had in the home, and I was so sad because Grandma had been out of it all day. Then when I was talking about the weekends we used to spend together, she looked at me and suddenly her eyes were real clear. She said, "Granddad and I never understood how you were able to sleep around that noisy ghost. We were used to it, but we figured it would wake you up for sure." It was the briefest moment of clarity, after which the elderly woman slipped back into her vague fog. In that moment, however, Donna learned a great deal. Her grandparents had never mentioned the noisy entity to her, just as she had never mentioned it to them. But all the while, everyone had been aware of what was impossible to ignore. The little farmhouse near South Hay had most certainly been haunted. This story takes place in Porcupine River, Saskatchewan. The Porcupine River Wraith. The men were sitting in a semicircle, a collection of bright plaid flannel shirts in stark contrast to the muted autumn colors of the forest. They nudged the wet brown leaves from their boots, and occasionally someone would clear his throat. Aside from that, they waited silently. Every twig that was rustled by a small scurrying animal grabbed their attention. Every bird call was noted. The reassuring, returning footsteps of their leader could not be heard. However, and despite the powerful rifles that rested in their hands, the men looked nervous. Claude THRU was more nervous than the rest. It was his father who was leading the group of hunters, and finally 20 minutes had passed since he had ventured down the river to investigate a noise. Actually, it was not just a noise. Noises were routine in the northern woods, which teemed with life. This had been a bone-chilling shriek, an unearthly sound not belonging to or expected in the clean wilderness of northern Saskatchewan. It had been too long. Claude stood and cocked his rifle, I'd best go take a look, he told the other men, and headed off to follow his father's trail through the bush. It was the fall of 1939, and the young hunting and fishing guide was about to see something that would change his belief system forever. Claude cautiously made his way down to the bank of the Porcupine River. He then crept northward, keeping his rifle ready and his eyes alert every step of the way. His ears were filled with the peaceful sounds of rushing water, but his mind seemed intent upon replaying the horrid sound he had heard only an hour earlier. The anguished shriek had paled the most seasoned members of the hunting party, including Claude's unshakable father. "That's no animal," he had said before leaving to investigate. In such a remote place, that which wasn't an animal or a hunter was a cause for concern. When Claude had made his way a quarter-mile up the river, he saw his father. The man was standing on the bank, staring out over the churning water. He appeared transfixed by something, and the relief Claude felt at seeing him was quickly replaced with unease when he saw what his father was staring at. There, hovering like a mist over the water, was an eerie phantom-like shape, the form wreathed and pulsed. Claude's father stood with his arms hanging limply by his side. His rifle lay forgotten on the ground. He seemed unable to look away. "Dad! Dad!" Claude shouted over the sounds of the river. This seemed to break the spell, and elder THRU spun around and raised a warning hand. "Don't come any closer," he begged his son. "Turn your back and don't look around." Claude was frightened, but followed his father's directions without question. For several minutes he stood that way, hardly daring to breathe. Finally his father was by his side. In a shaky voice, the older man said, "Let's get out of here right away. I've just seen the lost river wraith, and you know what that means." Claude stared at his father in shock. "Sure, I know what that's supposed to mean, but it's a silly legend, isn't it?" He could see the answer in his dad's ashen face. "It's more than a legend," the man said flatly. "I just saw the thing with my own eyes." The story was local lore, known to anyone who had grown up as Claude had, in the small town of Stony Rapids. As people sat around their campfires during the brief summer, they loved to tell the gruesome tale of a haunted spot on the Porcupine River, no more than 50 miles away. While the firelight danced on their faces, they would often explain that there had been a murderer who was shot along the riverbank by a vengeful village mob. But he did not die from the bullets, the storytellers would say. That would have been too swift and kind. The mob who had gunned him down saw fit to drag the man into the river and pin his legs beneath a heavy boulder. There they left him to die of his wounds. Ever since, it was said that the spirit of the dead man haunted that spot on the river. The specter was destined to remain there for all eternity, and any mortal who was luckless enough to see it was doomed to die within a year. Claude knew the legend well, and now he knew that there really was a ghost to be seen at that spot at the Porcupine River. But the curse, he couldn't allow himself to believe it, especially regarding his father, who was hale and hearty and only 52 years of age. 3 months later, Claude believed in the curse too. His robust father lay on his deathbed, offering a few final words of advice to his son. "You know where the Wraith is," he gasped. "Don't ever go near that place on the river again," Claude promised as his father died. Claude THRU carried on his father's work as a hunting and fishing guide, and always conscientiously avoided the cursed stretch of river. A friend of Claude's, a man named Roger Leclerc, made frequent jokes about his silly superstition. "One day I'll go looking for your river wraith," he laughed. "I am brave enough to stare into the face of a little harmless water spray." True to his word, Roger Leclerc did travel to the haunted spot on the river that Claude had told him about, and he must have looked into what he thought to be nothing more than mist rising from the churning water. There was no way to know for certain, however, because the man's lifeless body was later pulled from Porcupine River. His face, it was said, was contorted in an expression of sheer terror. The townspeople of Stony Rapids wondered what had killed Roger Leclerc, but Claude THRU knew. Roger's death had been further proof, although Claude hadn't needed any, that the lost Wraith of Porcupine River was much more than just a legend. Claude went on to spend decades working as a wilderness guide in the area. He knew the best areas to hunt and places along the river where the water teemed with fish. Despite occasional requests, however, he never once took anyone close to the haunted spot in the Porcupine River. After all, a good hunter always knows when he's become the prey, and his weapon has become useless. 2 deaths had been more than enough to convince Claude THRU that the famous Porcupine River Wraith was deadly and real. This story takes place in rural Saskatchewan at a farm near Saskatoon. Dandelions for Margaret. For the children who grew up in rural Saskatchewan in the lean depression years, there were not many ready-made amusements. We didn't have rooms full of toys and video games, recalled a woman named Margaret, who spent her youth on a farm near Saskatoon. You counted yourself lucky if your family had a radio. We used to make our own fun, and we turned whatever was around us into a playground. One rather odd choice of a playground was an old country cemetery not far from the schoolhouse that Margaret attended. Many of the children enjoyed spending time there, playing, talking, and making up stories about the people whose names appeared on the headstones. We were never disrespectful, stressed Margaret. If anything, we had great respect for the people buried there. At least we came to visit them. Not many others did. It was just a sort of private place for us. The only grown-ups who were there couldn't boss us around. During the school year, Margaret would visit the cemetery with her friends. During the summer months, however, she frequently went alone. It was then that she spent more time examining each marker in the tiny, ragged burial ground, and imagining how each of those lives must have lived. One grave in particular really captured her imagination. There was one tombstone I would always visit. It was a woman's grave, and her name was Margaret, like mine. She had died very young, just after World War I, so it might have been the Spanish flu or something. Anyway, I just made a point of always visiting her. I'd talk to her a little and tell her things, and usually I'd leave her a bouquet of flowers. Margaret laughed when she recalled this, for her floral bouquet was normally made up of dandelions. It wasn't that there were no wild flowers to be found during the prairie summer, but rather that 10-year-old Margaret simply thought the dandelions with their brilliant yellow blooms were the most beautiful blossoms to be found. She seldom left the cemetery without placing a sunny bundle of them on the late Margaret's grave. As the years passed and the little girl grew into a teenager, she spent less and less time climbing over the weathered wooden fence that surrounded the graveyard. There were other things to think about, such as friends and boys, and the community hall dances that she was sometimes permitted to attend with her parents. One day, when she was 14, Margaret realized that she hadn't been by the cemetery in nearly a year. I just kind of felt an urge to visit, she said, and since I was going to go away to school soon, I thought it might be nice to say goodbye. It was a beautiful June day. Margaret dutifully finished her chores at home, then strolled down the dusty road for a mile to the cemetery. Along the way, she gathered up a bouquet of dandelions to leave at the other Margaret's grave. By then, I knew that was kind of stupid, she said, but it was a tradition, so I stuck with it. Margaret was feeling far too mature to hop the fence, so she unlatched and carefully pushed at the ancient gate. The post had settled so far into the ground that she couldn't make it swing more than 2 feet, but it was enough to allow her to slip through. Once inside, she walked over to the grave site she had so often visited and sat down cross-legged on the grassy earth. The canopy of the poplar leaves created little dancing spots of sun and shadow on the weather-worn headstone. Margaret brushed a few twigs away from her namesake's eternal resting place and soaked in the peaceful atmosphere of the forgotten little piece of land. A bird chirped happily in a nearby tree, and insects hummed lazily through the warm summer air. Margaret drew a deep, contented breath. Then she spent a few minutes talking to the late Margaret, telling her about all the exciting changes in her life. When she finished speaking, she remembered the little bunch of dandelions already becoming limp on the ground beside her. I picked them up and sort of arranged them nicely, and then said, "Here you go, Margaret. These will have to last you for a while." Margaret recalled. She then set the blossoms down at the base of the headstone and proceeded to have one of the most affecting experiences of her life. "I didn't know how to describe it then," she said, "but now I guess I would say that the atmosphere changed. Everything in that cemetery was the same. I could hear the birds and the flies buzzing, and I could see the sun and the grass and the breeze moving the leaves. But it was like I was inside a glass bubble. The air right around me was different. I was sort of detached, and then I'll never forget it. I felt this pressure on my shoulder as though someone had placed a cool hand there, and I heard the words, 'Thank you.' It wasn't out loud. It was like someone whispered it inside my head. And a split second later, everything was back to normal. Normal, except that Margaret had experienced something that was magnificent and rare. More than 60 years later, she still treasures the memory of that moment when she received the gift of gratitude from beyond the grave." This story takes place in Yorkton, Saskatchewan. A ghost affects the vote. On April 27th, 1942, the Regina Leader-Post ran an interesting item that had come from its Yorkton bureau. According to the article, a plebiscite was to be held at Poplar Springs School, north of Yorkton. On that day, it was suggested that the outcome of the vote had perhaps already been affected by one of the area's earliest settlers, a man who had been dead for decades. On the Thursday prior to the vote, speeches were to be held at the Poplar Springs School. Dr. C.J. Houston and Steve Penarowski were two of the speakers scheduled for that day. Only 100 yards into their 4-mile journey to Poplar Springs, however, the vehicle that the men were driving became stuck in the mud. It took 15 men to push the car from its mucky trap, and one of them pointed out to the two travelers that following a recent rain, the entire road was likely to be soft and treacherous. Dr. Houston and Mr. Penarowski decided that it would be wise to take another road to their destination. It just so happened that the speaker's alternate route took them directly over the grave of one of the southeast Saskatchewan's pioneers. The rural burial site had been reported to be haunted since the day someone saw fit to build a road squarely over top of it. Usually around midnight, local farmers saw a phantom light hovering over the exact spot where the settler had been laid to rest. It seemed obvious that the man's spirit was unhappy about the disturbance of his grave. According to the Leader-Post article, he may also have had an opinion to express in the impending plebiscite. As Houston and Penarowski drove unwittingly over the haunted spot, the road suddenly collapsed under the vehicle's wheels. In a matter of seconds, the car became hopelessly trapped with two wheels resting in the settler's grave. The two would-be speakers were terribly discouraged, but not yet beaten. They first tried to jack the car out of the hole. When that failed, they trudged to a nearby farm and enlisted the help of a man and his team of horses. The farmer was quite willing to lend a hand, but though the horses sweated and strained, the mirrored car would not budge. Eventually the doubletree to which the horses were harnessed snapped, and the three men were forced to admit defeat. Luckily, another local resident happened by at that moment. The man was driving a powerful 5-horse team and offered his assistance. It was greatly accepted. Midnight approached as the larger team of horses was hitched to the vehicle. Several neighbors began appearing on the scene not to help, for they hadn't known anything was amiss, but to encounter the ghost. The people had noticed the lantern lights bobbing around the grave after dark and thought that the spirit was having a wild night. They were disappointed to discover that the pioneer's specter had not materialized, but interested to note that he had managed to trap a car. With 5 brawny horses pulling diligently at the vehicle, it was finally freed from its awkward predicament. The leader post summed up the aftermath. Dr. Houston and Mr. Penarowski paid the farmers $4 for getting the car out of the grave and wondered whether Prime Minister Mackenzie King would see that their dry cleaning bill, a considerable item, was paid. Dr. Houston lost his rubbers many times and found them again, but finally failed to recover them, which in view of the rubber shortage added to his difficulties. The greatest loss for the 2 men was that they missed their opportunity to speak before the plebiscite. They counted themselves lucky, however, that they passed midnight in the grave of the old pioneer. They did not encounter his eerie apparition. This story takes place in Lafleche, Saskatchewan. The Lafleche Cemetery Wraith. One March evening in 1936, 2 men were walking along the road that led northeast to Lafleche. The friends were more than familiar with the route, for one of them lived in town, and the other on a farm a short distance away. Whenever they socialized together, it was customary for one to walk the other at least part of the way home. At the Lafleche Cemetery, which was about 1.5 miles outside of town, they usually parted ways. On this particular evening, the soothing balm of spring was in the air, and the men lingered a while before saying goodbye. They leaned casually against the cemetery fence, smoking and exchanging yawns until something strange caught their attention. In the center of the graveyard, the friends saw a human figure moving to and fro in a slow and even manner. The apparition was blurred along the edges and seemed not to notice them as they gaped at it. Determined to find out if their imagination was playing tricks on them, they hopped the fence and went to investigate. When they reached the spot, however, no trace of it could be found. Perplexed, the friends returned to the fence. Once there, they saw the mysterious shape moving again. By this time, both men were convinced that there was something very strange happening in the cemetery. They thought it best to stick together and go back into town. There they related their experience to several people. A subsequent report in the Regina Leader-Post offered proof of their sincerity, saying that to show their bona fides, the men offered to take affidavits as to the truth of their statements.